Good evening and welcome to the Pandemic Podcast with me, Dan Astin-Gregory. Tonight, I'm delighted to be joined by Baroness Fox, who's also the director of the Academy of Ideas, where we're going to be unpacking her views on the pandemic response and all of the latest headlines around vaccine passports, as well as her take on the role of the Lords. We've obviously seen over the last 12 months some interesting challenges politically, so I'm really curious to get an inside view today, not only on the overall political process surrounding the pandemic response, but also the role of the Lords in how we move forward from here. So welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
It's good to be with you.
So to open us up, I'd be very just curious to broadly ask you your interpretation of the political response to COVID-19. You know, your initial reactions to the outbreak and perhaps how that may have adapted over time as things have gone on.
I think that I won't be the only person in the country who was initially very scared. Everybody was, because, you know, I don't know, Camus is one of my favourite writers, and I'd read The Plague, and you know, I didn't want to underestimate, and I thought, if this is going to have a devastating impact on people like Ebola or, you know, one of these terrible illnesses, then like everyone else, it was how best to handle it. By the way, that was, when I say initially, I mean, initially I obviously was like, oh, they're overreacting. Why are they calling it a pandemic? So I don't mean I had a great insight. I mean, as soon as we understood that it wasn't just a kind of hyped up scare campaign, and maybe it's worth noting that Matt Ridley, who's actually in the Lords, but the scientist, great science journalist, had said, you know, the establishment have cried wolf for so often. You know, there's been a pandemic of obesity, pandemics of mental health, pandemics of domestic abuse, pandemics of sugar eating. You know, I mean, there was pandemics a go, and then they said there's a pandemic, and we all go, yeah. You know what I mean? Nothing's happening. Then we realised, oh, it's a pandemic, and then it got scary, and we didn't understand it. And of course, I'm not an epidemiologist, didn't understand it any more than anyone else. So that was my initial response. And even though I was very, very, very hesitant about a lockdown strategy in terms of closing the whole society, I was prepared to say, well, of course, extraordinary measures have to be taken, which was my reference to Camus' The Plague, where in fact the political elite in that just sort of said carry on as normal as we were dropping dead on the streets. And, you know, it was infantile and, you know, putting their head in the sand. So I could accept that. Where, of course, I started to get very anxious was when political decisions were making, like the COVID legislation, which was a huge attack on civil liberties. Again, maybe that's necessary, you could have thought at the time, but it was when you started to query it and say, I remember saying on social media and then actually on a radio program, where's the sunset clause if this is an emergency thing? And people started saying, are you denying the seriousness of the situation, or one of you? And I said, no, I'm asking a perfectly legitimate question. So when you started to see that kind of slightly censorious reaction, that made me very nervous. And also I was very frustrated about what I saw to be a great upsurge of community resilience and courage, people saying, I want to offer to help, I'm prepared to volunteer, I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to fight off this virus. And, you know, there was all these kind of headlines about people signing up to be volunteers, and then they basically didn't bother contacting them. In other words, people were demobilized. So what could have been a very positive moment for community building and so on was then effectively defanged very early on, and people became demoralized and lost their bearings in many ways. So that was my initial response. The only thing to add is, as we have come to understand the virus more and more, and even those of us who are lay people, you know, this was an opportunity. We were in lockdown after all to ask questions and listen to the scientists and listen to well-informed voices and trying to work it out, because we were all trying to work it out. The more we were told that we weren't encouraged to do that, and even worse than that, people were being censored by big tech. And so films that people would say to me, you must look at that interview with so-and-so, and I try and find out being removed. And immediately that makes you think, just hold on. This is not the right response. You know, it might be a scary virus, but in order to tackle it as a community, collectively, if we want to have social solidarity, we have to know more, ask questions, and your slogan is question everything. And that indeed was the slogan of LM magazine, which used to be Living Marxism, which I was publisher of. Our slogan was question everything. You know, you want to question everything, not because you're a contrarian, but because you are. That's the whole point, you know, of being human in a way, that you get the opportunity, and it's the endeavor of science and the endeavor of rationality and reason and enlightenment thinking, to just say, explain that to me again. I don't understand that. I want to look at the other side of the story. And when they stopped allowing that to happen, I could see that we were in dangerous political territory, never mind dangerous public health territory.
Absolutely. Really interesting to hear you say that. And I think your example to illustrate that is testament. When you asked about the sunset clause and you met with, don't you understand the severity of the situation? It's like, well, both of those things can coexist. You can understand the severity of a situation and ask a personally reasonable question, which is one of many reasonable questions that I think have been left unanswered throughout this. And sadly, that's one of the kind of almost stock responses that is received to any critical questioning around this, which is, I find, deeply concerning. I mean, what do you think what has led to this lack of critical discussion? It just feels like a blanket response that almost any critical voice has been censored, deplatformed, smeared, all asking valid questions.
Well, I think that you can't. You know, one of the things that we all have to remember, I suppose, is that all of the trends that we've seen emerge during the last 18 months existed before. I mean, you know, the delegitimizing of political positions that you don't agree with has been familiar to any of us, certainly to me, who was involved in the Brexit discussions. I mean, you know, it's been part of the kind of rouse around identity politics for quite a long time. So there's become a sort of playbook of how you kind of delegitimize somebody, your opponent. And you can say, well, why do they do that? Well, I think it's a lack of confidence, actually. I mean, that, you know, there's a way of winning an argument without having to win an argument. You kind of like remove the people who are asking awkward questions. And of course, you know, some of the people asking awkward questions are awkward squad, and it is annoying, and you are in an emergency, and you probably, if you're a politician, just think, oh, for God's sake, well, I don't want to know. But I'm not listening. You know, I'm not interested in Dan or Claire, you know, spouting off with their questions. You know, I want to get on. I need to solve the PPE crisis. You need to sort this. And I understand that. But the truth is, in a free society, that's what you're supposed to be able to do. And as it happens, I think when you face an unprecedented crisis, and in many ways, I think it has been an unprecedented crisis, the more collective mind you have together, the better, it seems to me. I mean, you want an active, an intellectually active, inquiring public, even if you've demobilized them physically to sit at home, or a lot of them, to help you solve some of the problems, you know, to say, well, what are we going to do about the care homes? Why don't we involve them? Whereas it's like sort of, because they made a mess of the care home situation, then they're kind of so busy covering it up. The last thing they want is people kind of like going in and volunteering at the care homes. Do you know what I mean? Because they'd made a mistake. And I think it was, I mean, I don't think it was remotely purposeful. It was a kind of like panic reaction. Clear the hospitals, NHS, the most important thing. Shove everyone into care homes. Oh God, we've shoved in all these untested people. You know, so let's talk about care homes anymore, and don't let any volunteers near them and all that. So these are the reasons. So what I'm saying is these trends existed before. The precautionary principle is something I've been arguing against as the climate of safetyism is what I wrote my book on, how safetyism has been used to thwart free speech. You know, that's what safe space is. You know, the clues in the word safe. Being safe and protecting people from ideas has been a common theme that some of us have been going on about for a long time, but which, you know, people thought we were just kind of exaggerating. So what has happened is the political elite who run society have garnered the ideas that they've been kind of using for the last decade or so, and it became and kind of like went with them. They just didn't have the imagination or the courage to look around for new ways of approaching things. And the final one, of course, is experts. And I'm not being glib at all, but we've just come out of a phase of political technocracy, which a lot of us, well, you know, quite a lot of people associated with being in the European Union, and I'm not trying to open that debate, but the critique by many of us for why being in the EU was problematic was that it handed over decision making away from the demos to an unaccountable elite of experts who thought they knew better than anyone else. And alongside that has been a long-standing commitment to scientism, the notion that science was able to solve every problem, which is, to me, a gross, by the way, distortion of Enlightenment thinking, which is the use of reason and the celebration of science as a liberation, as a possible liberation, but not the science, and without treating scientists as the experts. And we end up in a situation straight after we'd actually enacted the take back control movement, where they said, well, you just took back control, well, we're taking it back off you again. And suddenly the experts were back in, you know what I mean? And we're all sitting at home on the couch waiting to be told what to do again. And although it's very stark, in a way, that was what politically the objection to the EU was, this idea that there was these people who knew best and you had to sit and listen to them and do what you told. I mean, look, these are real epidemiological experts in a virus terms. What do I know and all the rest of it? But nonetheless, I'm making that political point that the political elite felt at home with a technocratic approach to this virus. That they knew where they were, because that's where they've run things for a long time. They actually find real democracy frightening, and so demobilizing the demos of the democracy bit was something which was kind of a bit of a kind of not only were they protecting us, but it was also a kind of remove them as the problem that we might have to negotiate with. And we were all told to, shut up and put up, basically.
Well, you've really highlighted two problems that I find absolutely terrifying. One is the culture of safetyism. You probably know Professor Frank Freddy, who he gave a talk at the Lockdown Summit last Saturday, talking about the illusion that freedom and safety are a trade-off, but also the role of the technocratic approach to this. And again, both of these situations, cultural safetyism has been growing rapidly prior to the pandemic, but it feels like it's just exploded in a 12-month period. And you're absolutely right. We've almost had a 5-minute gap between the kind of technocratic approach within a wider sphere, and now again it's doubled down on our own shores, which leads me to wonder: is this something that is the technocratic approach something that is become institutionalized on a national level? Is this a global cultural disposition? And what's led us to this point, do you think?
Well, I mean, there's been a disillusion with democracy for quite some time. I mean, it's almost like there's kind of both on left and right a kind of disillusion with the masses has been a domination, has dominated, a lot of the post-war period. I mean, actually, the masses were blamed for the rise of fascism. That was a kind of intellectual justification for what happened in Germany. People wanted to say, oh yeah, they were voted in, they were all, look what happens when the populace, if you look at the transnational sort of discussions in Europe, which by the way included Churchill, it was kind of like, we can't let those, kind of plebs, take control again. And obviously prior to that, there'd been the Russian Revolution. So there was this notion of, you don't want that lot taking over because it all goes horribly wrong. So it's always been, we're Democrats with caveats, and then the left became quite disillusioned. I said, broadly people on the left, because the Labour Party couldn't get elected, and people started saying, they've got false consciousness, these masses, they don't really know what's good for them, so we might know. So what I'm saying is there's been a move in that direction, and everything from international law, human rights legislation, of these things which are transnational, which basically remove decision making from direct democratic control. It's like, so we have to, and that's where the EU fits in, but the EU is not the only example of it. It just was part of it. And I think the main thing that I'd say is how the ruling classes of many countries have coped and run things, have moved in that direction. And then we've also seen the political parties, these are mainstream political parties in the throughout the world as it happens. I mean, not just in Europe, certainly through the Western world, who have become dislodged from their base, and become kind of technocratic managerial parties. And one of the things that happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, and by the way, in case anyone's worried, as I was the publisher of Living Marxism, I was glad to see them go, because they'd been a kind of great sort of seething sore. Anyone who was progressive, you didn't want anyone to think that was remotely the kind of society you wanted. But nonetheless, when they went, Margaret Thatcher said, there is no alternative now. And Francis Fukuyama said this is the end of history. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because the political parties then it was seen that, oh yes, it's the end of ideology. And that's where you start to get Blairism, you kind of get this kind of conservatism without its roots. It's kind of like, this is it, this is what, and if there is no alternative, if there was no alternative, and this was it started to be a bit thin. But the political parties started to have managers rather than ideologues. And people thought that was good. The difficulty was that they just basically became indistinguishable from each other almost, right? And they never had to be accountable. So we're obviously familiar with this here, a kind of technocratic Labour Party that's full of middle managers, a Tory party that nobody recognises as being conservative anyway. I mean, they've been going on for some time, yeah? So the populist rebellions in, America, in Europe, in the UK around Brexit, but throughout Europe, where social democratic parties, conservative Christian Democrat parties have all lost major elections, all sorts of confusions happening all over the place, would indicate to you that that clash between technocracy and democracy has been existing for some time. And this is where I kind of clash with the conspiracy mongers. It's a kind of slightly long, complicated story. Now, it's not surprising to me that in the context of this terrible pandemic, that an opportunism amongst those technocratic political leaders in all the different countries was not to kind of go, I mean, it's an opportunism, but it's also a kind of knee-jerk reaction. It's what they know best, yeah? Was not to look to ordinary people to solve the problems, but to immediately to revert to what they were best at, which was to exclude the democratic mass of society and to gather around them the people who would, not have to be accountable. And that's what they've done. It's not a plan. It's not a transnational plan. It's been international trends, though, that have been there for all to see for some time. But it's just that a lot of people weren't looking. You see what I mean? It's like nudge. Everybody's now discovered the nudge unit, behavioral psychology. I mean, quite a lot of us were going on about it. When it started, I gave so many talks. I mean, not because I'm clever or anything, by the way. All I mean is that it was a thing which I could see was really anti-democratic, because the nudge unit, when it first set up, and they concentrated on actually often on happiness and making people happy. But what they were basically saying was, we know what makes you happy more than you know what makes you happy. So we've developed techniques around behavioral psychology and behaviorism and so on that can help you be the best you would want to be, and we can do that without you making too much effort. We'll organize it for you. And I made the point that this was an explicit rejection of persuasion and convincing people, and was anti-democratic. I wasn't the only one. Lots of people did it, but it was a bit of a minority sport. Most people, if you went out and said the nudge unit, went, what are you talking about, right? Fair enough.
Yes. Yeah.
We've now seen that culminate. So it's not suddenly like this conspiracy where they've taken over. They've been chipping away for a while. And it's just obvious they were the tools which the people who are running society turned to when they were themselves facing an emergency and didn't know what to do. They went to their mates. They went to the people and the political positions and the ideas that they were familiar with and trusted. And they just happened to be the ones that I think are anti-democratic.
I mean, there's a couple of things I pick up on it. I've tried to explain this situation as a kind of a yarn, ball of yarn, and you have to pull out each individual strand, because there are these trends and political, social, cultural trends that we've seen unfolding over time, which really I find have come to a head in the last 12 to 18 months. And but at the same time, a lot of people are saying, oh, there must be a plan. When you see countries doing the same thing at the same time around the world, whether that's vaccine passports or lockdowns, I find it hard to believe that there's a smoky room of people pulling the strings and all saying we're going to do this together. But
they lack imagination, and I mean, you're making it sound as though, like, when when they went to war in Iraq, the reactions to 9/11 were all the same. You know what I mean? Around the world in many instances, right? But that lacks a lack of imagination as well. The human rights agenda, which is sort of an international set of standards, which actually many of which are actually, you might think, oh, well, it might guarantee free speech, but it's always, we guarantee free speech except in these 26 circumstances, and everyone has signed up to that internationally, right? In other words, it's it's not a big surprise that there's that internationally, the people who run societies internationally talk to each other. It's a question of whether people think it's a plan. That's a different thing, right? The whole idea that this was contrived in some way. And I mean, I just kind of looked at a few things on the chat, and people say, well, is it really a democracy? Maybe it's a dictatorship. I mean, I believe in a democracy because I believe in the demos, and I believe in people's autonomy, and I believe in agency and people's capacity to make a difference in society. And so do they, but there's a clash all the time about how much democracy. And that's always been a row that's gone on. And to a certain extent, a lot of times we've been quite, those of us who wanted the democratic square and the public square to be livelier have failed to enthuse people to want to do that, right? And therefore haven't allowed it. But then we were saying in the chat, it's a dictatorship, and as soon as you have Marxism, capital flak, and they're all now it's like, and you just think, oh God, I feel like I'm in an undergraduate seminar now. And there's too much. In my opinion, of course it is absolutely only my opinion, there's too much attempting to see things that aren't there and to try and kind of imbue this with some life that it just doesn't have, right? What we are facing is bad enough, which is that there's people who run starting haven't had a clue how to deal with this situation, and still don't swap ideas with each other. That might be, but it's not a contrivance to bring in a dictatorship. But the illiberal instincts that we see have existed on the left and right for some time. And the truth is, those of us like me, maybe like you, who believe in free speech or believe in free societies, have not won the arguments with our fellow citizens. These are negligence, right? I mean, you realize the thin veneer of an attachment to a free society or freedom of speech when people are prepared to go, oh, well, you can't, that's our fault, right? And we've got to convince people. And I don't think trying to say it's not our fault, it's because they've got a plan and we're powerless and weak helps. It actually makes us look pathetic, right? It's up to us and every generation to find stronger arguments to convince young people, for example, or everyone, of the importance of why you need to defend freedom of speech, or why you need to defend personal autonomy, or why you need to defend agency, and why safety is not more important than freedom, and so on and so forth. And we have to get better at it. And we've all learned that lesson very bitterly, I think, this time.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complex situation, and I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a sense of disempowerment, and I've always said, whether you're outside of this pandemic, the moment you point your finger outside of yourself and play the blame game, whether it's in personal relationships or any other circumstance, you're removing your own personal responsibility in the situation and your own personal power. Now, big societal issues, a lot of people say, well, it's outside my locus of control. How do I influence this? And I think there are swathes of people who feel completely disempowered right now. And I think where people say it's like a dictatorship, I think when you see the kind of rule, it does start to feel a little bit like rule by decree when you see pieces of legislation dreamt up on a Sunday, passed by Monday morning, no scrutiny. I saw a tweet, I think by Mark Harper or someone today, talking about Boris's wishes for the vaccine passports being pushed forward without any scrutiny. It starts to feel a bit more dictatorial, certainly rule by decree, when you have the absence of the kind of democratic process. And whilst I do agree that, it is down to the public to uphold those standards, I think the public feels somewhat disempowered against the scope and scale of the institutions that wield the power at present, and also beyond the government. the corporate influence that plays a role in the technocratic momentum. Whilst it may not be a group of individuals pulling the strings, you certainly have a lot of corporate influence over policy, which may or may not be playing a role in the kind of technocratic move through this cultural safetyism. I try and think about where the origins are of these things. I know I'm kind of commenting on the whole situation here, but to that point, then when you start to see these what I would describe as undemocratic behaviors, and people start to feel disempowered and disenfranchised, how does one begin to challenge that? Because I think a lot of people right now are feeling frustrated and disenfranchised, disgruntled at the least.
So do I. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, it's like utterly galling. I understand that. But, when I hear people describing other people as being sheeples, have been bought off. Yeah, but there's a lot of that, right? As it were, there's a lot of that on the lockdown skeptical side of the argument is as anti-democratic as the other side, right?
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Totally agree.
I don't believe in democracy. Those stupid thickos, why have they bought along with it? Why are they so scared all the time? What is wrong? You think, great, that's going to really work as a moment. And we'll talk about our attitudes to vaccines in a moment. But I really have, I just want to emphasize, because it's easy for me to criticize. I mean, God, I don't need to tell this audience the problem of the government, right? And of course it's true what you're saying. I mean, there's been an atrocious suspension of democratic accountability. I mean, at the formal level of parliamentary scrutiny, never mind at any other level. We've witnessed some of the most egregious examples of exploiting this situation to get through legislation which should never have got through, at least without a row. So I don't want to take from that, and I don't want to take from the fact that it's almost irrational. And the point about the Mark Harper tweet was exactly that. That actually there's people sitting in the cabinet, they think they've more or less agreed that they're not going to bring in vaccine passports, and kind of enrages a few types who just force them through. Now, I mean, this, if that's to be believed, you know what I mean? That they sort of, and it's their policies are contradictory. I mean, if they've got a plan, they're not executing it well. I mean, and their plan keeps backfiring. They think the way to do this is this, then it backfires, they do something else. It's the greatest knee jerk. They are in a panic, reactive, no long-term thinking at all example of how not to rule a society, right? And obviously, even in a democracy, you have people who rule in the sense that they are responsible for making decisions. Their decision making's been all over the place, and that has been helped by the fact that the mass of people have been demobilized. That's what I'm saying. I mean, if you're all sitting at home, and by the way, I don't think they did this to do that. I'm saying is their strategy was to send us into lockdown, and the consequence of that was a lot of people lost confidence, because you're atomized, you're not seeing people, you're not able to go and have a chat with your mates, and sort of where actually you're kind of really scared and you're thinking one thing and somebody else says, oh, don't be daft, lad, or or whatever. The way we get through life is our one-sided eccentricities, as it were, which we've all got, usually kind of balance out through society. That's what society is. We come together at work, we go to the pub, or we might go to a political meeting, but it might be just that we go to the football, we have a chat, somebody says something, you say, what a stupid idea that, you kind of one way or another, you're challenged all the time. We've been sitting on our own in many instances, and even where you've been, obviously millions of people, by the way, carried on working to service those at home. I understand that, but they then weren't able to kind of have a chat after work in the pub, right? So we've been isolated and atomized, and it meant that the government not only didn't have parliamentary scrutiny because Parliament hasn't operated properly, but it also hasn't had the full force of public opinion. So, and polling has been, God knows about the polling, but in a way, people's views have been distorted. I've known people that I thought were really, together, sort of all right people, and they were genuinely, they lost they lost it a bit. You know what I mean? They were scared, and they didn't. Yeah. If you don't leave the house, you actually forget what public life is. You know what I mean? Yeah. They became quite draconian when they're quite liberal normally, because they weren't under pressure from peers and things like that. Anyway, you get the gist of what I'm saying. So I understand. And when you say, what should we do? I mean, now, let's say now. See, I think we've got to find a very positive way of encouraging people to rebuild the public square. You know, I've got a minor contribution at the Academy of Ideas. We've got our Open for Debate first Battle of Ideas taster on Saturday. Bit of a plug there, 31st. Come along at the Heart of Westminster. But the reason I'm saying that is because it's actually quite nerve-wracking organising a public debate. And we've got a day of debate, and I'm actually terrified. This is what my bread and butter was, and it's nerve-wracking doing it. But let's get together. At least if there's 300-400 of us in the same room, we might actually shine some light on things. We've got to encourage people in that way. We've got to stop being so dismissive of our fellows who don't agree with us and kind of work through how we argue this. And we've got to recreate the public square so that the politicians feel the public breathing down their neck metaphorically, and they're not relying on front page headlines and the media as their mediation of the public, or polling organizations as their mediation of public opinion. And we've then got to try and shape and change public opinion by not saying the polls are all wrong, but actually by going to convince more people that now is the time we need to go back, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, there's so many points I want to pick up on here. So the lack of debate that we've witnessed, first and foremost, is being the most shocking part of this. We've touched on this already, and fascinating to hear what you're doing. We'll share the links to the debates you're putting on. But what I've observed, and I'd really interested in your take on this, there's kind of been a battle of ideology. You've got those who are debating on a kind of moral position or an ideological position versus those who are taking more of a logical, fact or evidence-based position. And those, I find that you see those two clash. And when someone has taken an ideological position, it's very difficult, I find, to see any punctuation of the kind of emerging evidence that may invalidate the kind of principles of that ideology. How do you have debate in the presence of something that's been moralized or made ideological?
Well, that's a difficulty, isn't it? Because I'm ideological, and I believe in principles. So if you're going to do a sort of discussion, for example, about pragmatism versus ideology or principle, maybe there's a pragmatic, evidence-based basis for vaccine passports. And before everybody leaps on me, I don't necessarily see it, but maybe there is one. But I would say, on principle, I wouldn't agree with them. You know what I mean, right? So, yes. But I did, if you bear in mind, I actually accepted that there might be need for emergency legislation, public health legislation, at the beginning of this lockdown. For a public health reason, I was actually saying it should have a sunset clause and proper scrutiny. I mean, when I've read the legislation subsequently, I've realized that whole swathes of it were absolutely draconian, shouldn't have been there. But that's not the point I'm making. Point is, we all balance those things all the time, right? But there are times when principle outweighs, and otherwise you end up. And I think that, by the way, when I say our side, I mean we're not necessarily going. I mean, I've only just met you, but broadly, those people who've been worried about the impact of lockdown, when we've kind of tried to do the discussion around the collateral damage of lockdown versus the dangers to people of this particular virus, is a bit like counting bodies. And we've done it as much as anyone else. No, this many people are going to die of cancer versus this many people are going to die of COVID. And it's all a bit unsavory, right? I mean, it's like, yes. It's like a bit like, what? That isn't really what? So I think that you've got to accept that we all can sometimes not want to look at the evidence because of our principles or our ideological take. But what, of course, is happening is, and I mean, this is presumably what you referred to, the whole thing has become very toxic. In a way, it's not ideological. It's more like identity politics, isn't it?
Yes.
People have become stuck in a tribe of ideas. And in order to indicate that they are the good people, they adopt this position. And there's been a successful, I think, demonization of people who are locked down, as skeptical of some of the lockdowns as, deniers or selfish or, libertarian to the point where they don't care about society. And the narrative goes, which of course I completely reject all of this. I'm just saying, the narrative goes, the mask wearers, the careful, are the ones who care. And that it's become a very destructive inability to talk to each other. But they are the outliers. There's that's like the what we used to call the, you know, well, a certain group of Remainers who are not all of the people who voted Remain. You know, they're the FBPE, you know, hardcore. But millions of people voted Remain and accepted the vote. You know, you've got some mad Brexiteers, but millions of people voted Leave, and they're normal people who just wanted to leave the EU, right? And the problem with social media being the basis on which we judge things is we see the outliers and the extremes. And we don't remember that there's loads of people who are just like sort of perfectly reasonable trying to work it out. And so I don't think you can't, those people who think that the lockdowns and mask wearing and maybe vaccine passports are a good idea, live on your street, go to the pub, and they're not tweeting lunacy on thing. They just think it's a good idea. And if you had a chat with them, they might say, well, maybe I'll change your mind. And likewise, if you talk to them, maybe you'll change your mind. In other words, you've got to be open-minded and not putting everyone into these identity boxes and then kind of writing them off, but know that there'll be a hardcore on both sides, you know, 500,000 on both sides who are kind of like never shall meet. I just don't want to be one of those 500,000 on either side. Actually, I mean, I recognize the 500,000 on my side, but I really think that I want to talk to the tens of millions else.
Yeah, I mean, it's been fascinating to watch unfold. I mean, the identity politics thing is another issue that's been a trend that is certainly accelerated and played a part in this. And people find heroes in people who see the world in the same way around singular issues. But then the moment they find that they see the world differently on another issue, it's like, no, I can't follow that person anymore. They think this way. And it's just like, hang on, human beings. I mean, I certainly have disagreed thoroughly. You can probably guess my position on the pandemic, thoroughly with friends, and simply Brexit's another contentious issue, you know. But you don't want to lose friendships over it, you know, because they're singular issues, and you know, there may be big issues, but nonetheless, in many ways, I think it becomes a reflection of your values, and that's why it becomes harder, you know.
Yeah, but that's the thing is, like, lots of people who supported the lockdown. Let's give you this example. A lot of people who supported a lot of lockdown measures and restrictions, and to put a sort of counter argument, actually, a lot of them were Leave voters, just as from the Northwest where I was an MEP. Yeah, and I was sort of surprised. You know, I was sort of like, oh, really? And the way they saw it, certainly initially, I mean, they've become quite cynical recently, but I'm just saying the way they saw it was, oh, for God's sake, you know, you've got all these kind of self-indulgent middle-class libertarians in the cities who are kind of complaining they can't do their yoga in the park, you know, and they were much more communitarian-minded, you know, which was, we're going to look after each other and we're going to do what's best for the elderly people and for the vulnerable, and we accept this, right? So they weren't like scaredy cats, as they've been sometimes caricatured. You know what I mean? They had a real sense of social solidarity. Now, I like to think I had a sense of social solidarity.
Yes, exactly. Same, yeah.
But I also would have, but they were also not screaming. They weren't shouting at me. I wasn't shouting at them. I just realized, oh, there's people, but people were caricaturing each side in a different way. So the reason I was using that as an example was, I think that most of us tried to get through this as best we could. You know, a lot of ordinary people, you know, sometimes we can use hyperbole to describe the suffering that people have gone through in relation to the lockdown. But then, you know, I was reminded by friends that a lot of people are quite resilient and got through, and, you know, there is a bit of stiff upper lip, and people sort of like, well, let's now enjoy the freedom we've got, and let's keep going back over it, and let's being so fatalistic and pessimistic all the time. We now got to grasp freedom. And so what I'm trying to say is that we just don't want to caricature each other. And I do appreciate that there are some very nasty, you know, people on all sides. Although I encountered the ones on who are kind of enthusiastic restrictors and pro-lockdown people. I encountered them more because they obviously hate me. But I don't think it's helpful for us to write off. What I'm saying is most people are not those people.
I agree.
And even if they support, even if in the polls they say, I think vaccine passports are a good idea, it's because they're trying to do the right thing. They're not motivated by being stupid. they think it's the right thing to do, or if they think that mandating vaccines for care workers is a good idea, it's not because they're like, I know care workers. I've got a number of mates who are care workers, right? Not a lot, but a number of mates, and they are split on it, right? Two of them think everyone should be mandated and anyone who never got a vaccine should be kicked out, and they're ordinary care workers, right? And some of them are going to lose their jobs because of that. They're working in different care homes. Now, all of them are my mate. I like them all, and all of them really care and love the people they've looked after throughout this pandemic, work their guts looking after people. So people have different approaches to things, and I just don't want us to imagine that if you are pro mandating care workers to have a vaccine, that you're a fascist who doesn't understand democracy and hates everyone and is part of a conspiracy to keep everyone, it's like, no, they maybe have got a view I don't agree with, and I'll argue with them. By the way, I am really hostile myself to the mandated vaccine for care workers. I'm just making the point that people's drivers in this are often very similar, but they've got a different way of dealing with it. And it's up to us who think that freedom is under jeopardy to explain and give life to that in a way that doesn't alienate the very people that we need to convince.
No, I agree. And you're absolutely right. And I think the offensive language that's used, I've had people on, I mean, even during this conversation, I've had plenty of guests on here to show different perspectives. And one of them, I stopped the interview and said, look, you've just got to stop with the hostility. I had someone from Sage and I had a fantastic chat with him afterwards. I recorded another broadcast about it, and lots of people apologized for their language. They said that they're feeling angry, they're feeling frustrated. And it may be a reflection of the sentiment that's out there right now, because I think a lot of the kind of Western values of liberty do feel compromised, and people hold that value very dearly. But you're right; it seems like societally there is a thin veneer, but I think there's a lot of energy and emotion, as we saw with Brexit. This again is an emerging trend which we're seeing through social media, the digital media, how it's polarizing and politicizing everything. Identity politics stuck in the middle here. The debate you mentioned around individualism versus collectivism is a fascinating debate, because again, I feel like I've been standing up for the collective by saying, well, hang on, what about those who are losing their education? What about the people in the hospital waiting list? What about the disabled who have had no access to care? What about the elderly who have lost their access to family and the things that, what about well-being and the joy de vivre itself, the things that mean, like, we reduced collectivism down to protection from COVID only.
But I think that's the thing, is when we talk to each other, we can make those points. But what I'm also saying is a lot of people haven't been doing that. So they've been trying to make sense of it with their families, and, you meet somebody and they've had to, one of their daughters has been shielding the whole time. So they've been very preoccupied with the family stuff, and then sort of helping a few neighbours and think, what's all these moaning going on? We've just got to get through this. I agree with you, right? For me, social solidarity was not allowing everything to be seen through the prism of COVID. And as we became familiar with the virus, and it seems ironic, but the more we became familiar with its limits in a way, the more the clampdown seemed to occur. So that of course made it even more frustrating.
But the more the hysteria followed with that as well, and that makes it very hard to bring things to kind of conscious awareness.
Absolutely. But I think there are, however, there are contentious discussions on, as our side, and I suppose the vaccine's one of them. I'm very pro-vaccine. These vaccines. I don't mean any vaccines. I mean these vaccines. I really was enthusiastic about there being a medical, technical solution to the virus bit of this. And therefore have followed very carefully the development of the vaccines and tried to understand it as much as possible. And I've got family and good friends who are in the field and understand these things. And not everybody is, of course. I understand that, and some people are worried about them and think they're untested. Although I think that some of that is lacks evidence. But anyway, but one of the things that strikes me, because this is like lots of people on the side of being lockdown skeptic. This is the reason I'm saying it, is because there's a split here that's emerged, which is people who are skeptical of the political measures that's been used in relation to the virus, but somebody like me is really enthusiastic about the vaccine, can be seen as, well, usually they call it controlled opposition. I'm bound to be in the pay of big pharma, etc., etc. Or that I don't. And then on the other hand, you've got, and I understand this, an overuse of the term anti-vaxxer, right? There's a way of discrediting people. But there's a tangle that we've got ourselves into here, it seems to me. And I suppose one of the things that I want to say is that I'm very enthusiastic about pharmacological solutions for health problems. They don't solve political problems. And the irony here is that pharmacological influence, which could have really helped in this instance, hasn't helped because it became a substitute for arguing for freedom. But that doesn't mean that I'm not pro the vaccine. Do you see what I mean? Like you can't just say the vaccine will give you freedom, because if you've lost the argument for freedom, then that won't make any difference. And we've seen that to be true. But I am worried about some of the trends that have become skeptical and cynicism about medical science, for example, emerging. And I suppose I think that's an argument that we probably have to have out. I've also become very conscious of the fact that, and I literally get these two groups muddled up. I think that there can be quite a lot of scaremongering around the vaccine that really mirrors the scaremongering we saw around the virus. Now, I don't think there should be any ban on any discussion of side effects of vaccines or any of the, not remotely. And in fact, I think the government and SAGE and everyone else are really stupid to have not had this out. People are worried about its impact on fertility. Well, talk to them about it, right? Well, and I don't mean patronize them. I mean, let's have that conversation. If there are people who are getting side effects that are damaging, if there is a discussion about whether children will be hurt, any of these things, right, should be openly debated. But when I hear the kind of if you take the vaccine, it will lead to this, and you're stupid if you take it and you don't understand, which is what I get all the time on social media. The danger is that it sounds just the kind of like the vaccine is as scary as the virus type thing. And it reminds me also of the long COVID kind of complaint, which is long COVID symptoms mirror almost entirely the if you take the vaccine, it leads to all these things. And it's like everybody is seeing the world through health. It's a bit, so for me, we've got to get out of that, right? I mean, you can have whatever view you want on the vaccine. I don't care, right? This is an argument we'll have down the pub, at a conference, what have you. The basis on which we should be able to open up society should not be opposition on that either way. And it should not matter. But there is a problem when being anti-vaccine passport, anti-mandated vaccine becomes slushed up with being anti-vaccine. And I am happy for people to be anti-vaccine, by the way. I'm not using a slur of anti-vaxxers. I mean, we know that some of those people on the demo and all that, I'm ignoring the fringe mad conspiracy lunacy at one extreme level, because I know that those people who try and associate most lockdown skeptics with that are just being disingenuous and dishonest. And that's a very small group. But you see my point, that I don't want it to be that we start having, if you don't want to take the vaccine, that's up to you. I'm actually going to enthusiastically encourage you. That's fine. I don't necessarily think that young people who take it are doing anything wrong to their bodies. That's an argument, but that's not the basis of politics. That's an argument about medical situations. And I don't want us to fall into confusing medicine and our attitudes to pharmaceuticals with our attitudes to freedom. We can agree across the barrier on that, it seems to me.
Well, there's a couple of points of agreement and a couple of points of disagreement on
that.
I
know, that's why I raised it.
Yeah, and I think I'll start with what I agree with. I think our access, our ability to access society, our right to liberty should, in my view, should not be conditional upon any immunization or any other medical factor or human characteristic. At any time in history, we've discriminated people's access to society based on any human character, choice or characteristic has ended woefully bad. And I think there's also the concern that if it's this vaccine, then it's the next one, and or something else, another medical condition or something else. All of a sudden, you've got digital social credit systems, which determine your, there's the whole dystopian pathway that could go upon. Similarly, I'm someone who's spent a decade in innovation and technology. I've worked with some of the biggest companies. I've worked with startups. So I'm all for innovation, medically or otherwise. But similarly, I think in terms of the technocratic piece, I think we've seen government overreach and continue to see. But I also feel we are seeing overreach within the pharmaceutical industry in terms of its its role in intervening into our lives. And actually, the idea that we've moved so far away from nature. I think it's a case of how do we get that balance between nature and progress, and I think it's swayed. And for me personally, I'd always had a healthy skepticism about any big industry, big food, big pharma, big media, big government, anything that's big. I think I have concerns about the power that it wields. And that healthy skepticism is transformed in 12 months to a complete erosion of trust. And I appreciate you have your views on the vaccines. I've not had a history of challenging vaccines, but in the last 12 months, I have been very concerned about the lack of transparency. But I echo the point around fear-mongering on all sides. If you're inflating the fear on the virus side and doing the same on the vaccines, we're all doing the same thing, and we can't actually get the transparent facts that we need to be able to make an informed evaluation of the situation.
Yeah, but the trend that you described, is it right? And just say, I suppose, is the one that I have been arguing against for a while, which is actually about the kind of balance between nature and progress. Because if you want, I'm much more on the pro-progress side, and have been for a long time. And I've kind of clashed with a lot of people, for example, in environmentalism, who want to say we've got to rebalance everything towards nature. And I've clashed with, family, friends, loved ones, and all the rest of it over, who kind of reject pharmacological interventions in general. And, everybody's kind of like doing alternative diets. And, maybe it's because I'm old enough to have remembered what the hippies were like, that the re-emergence of a new hippiedom drives me mad. But what I'm saying, which is this kind of like nature knows best, and we've got to be, it's like, oh, do me a favor. And I've watched some of the greatest transformations of our ability to be human and to live longer and so on because of medical science. So I'm a great supporter of it. And that involves, by the way, big pharma, right? Because they're the ones who actually often produce the drugs. But that doesn't mean that one doesn't have any skepticism about any of this. But the reason I'm saying that is this is a fascinating discussion, right? It's really good. But I've looked at some of the things on the chat, right? People are saying ridiculous. This is experimental. It's not to be trusted. I'm not taking that in my body, and all the rest of it, right? And it's like, fine. But that's, this is a different conversation. And one of the things I'm worried about, and by the way, somebody rightly said, it's not us that's doing this, the government set the terms of this debate around vaccines, right, in the latter period. And what I'm saying is, actually, there's a danger that we fall for that and we end up talking about vaccines the whole time, right? And the reason I'm erring against that, I'm saying, forget the pros and cons of the vaccines, because the principle that you made was nobody should be forced. I agree, absolutely. No one should be forced to have any medical intervention that they don't want. All right, that's the matter of freedom of conscience. The rows about what we think of the vaccine are perfectly legitimate. I'm not trying to ban them, but I think we've got dragged into them, and they've become like dominant. They're like they animate the lockdown skeptics far more than anything else, and that makes me nervous because I think we're seeing everything through the prism set by someone else. And then we get dragged into, are you anti-vax, anti-this vax? What's your attitude to nature? What's your attitude to anything? Bloody hell. This is fascinating, but it's not going to help us now. And we should object to the fact that the governments have forced the situation that we're in now to such an extent that we're replying to them without any kind of autonomy ourselves of what kind of society we want to live in. That's kind of where I get mad.
Yeah. I do think there are reasonable concerns around the vaccines, but you're absolutely right. You need to separate them because actually, for now, the best voices that I surround myself with are the ones that have been double jabbed, because they're the ones saying that vaccine passports are wrong. You know, they're more like that. Their opinion, to be quite frank, is more likely to be taken seriously than someone who hasn't been jabbed, because of that very mix up of ideology. And the reality is, until we can address all the issues on the individual basis, I think it's very, very difficult to actually make any progress. I think the vaccine passport debate is another one where we see decisions made where the second order consequences or spillover effects over the short, medium, and long term aren't evaluated. And I think it's driven. My belief is that vaccine passports are driven by this precautionary principle and excess cultural safetyism, but that comes at the expense of liberty, of open society, of choice, bodily autonomy, all of these things that are long cherished values that I do believe are under threat with the prospect of these. And to the point about, to go full circle a little bit about the idea of there being a plan. Well, it feels like whether it's vaccine passports or digital identification, it's no secret that these ideas have been discussed for a long time now. It's just they've come to a head, and as always, there's a crisis, and where there's a crisis, there's an opportunity. And we also know that in a crisis, the checks and balances. This is no secret either. You know, we can look back to history to show the same thing happens. We don't learn from it. We just plow on. And here we are about to make a decision. It doesn't feel like, I say we're about to make a decision. I don't think there is a we in this. It feels very much influenced society, but not just the United Kingdom. It feels like a global a transformation of the way that we operate. You know, what's your comment on the kind of global nature of this? And you know, if the argument is if France is doing it and Italy are doing it, no, we have to do it as well. There's no autonomous thinking. How do you break that bubble of the kind of a globalized shift that could have lasting consequences?
Well, I mean, you know, there's no doubt. You know, every week that there's you know, a march in Paris or a march in Dublin or whatever, you know, people put it up, and obviously there's international concern, just like there's global shifts. But you know, I think that we just have a very hard task ahead, which is that we have to win the arguments. I agree with something you said earlier on, very much so. You know, about the vaccine passports. For me, it's not the technicalities of a vaccine passport, you know, because actually, I'm appreciative of the fact that what's likely to happen is I haven't got the app or anything, but you know, what's likely to happen is people know I've had two. It's like I don't need it because everybody knows I've had the vaccine, so it's a bit cheating in a way, you know what I mean? But the precedent is so damaging, right? And the point that you've made, I think is going to happen is you can see that a lot of different political issues are going to be reposed now as public health issues. I can see environmentalism posed that way as well. You know, when I say some of the concerns around pollution, they start saying, well, you know, people's breathing and you know, it's a public health issue, and what you eat and whether and so on is a public health issue. And once you set this precedent, then you're going to get into very dangerous territory. And I you know, we're all be familiar with the fact, and one of the things, arguments I had in the Lords was when there was an attempt to bring in an amendment saying that it was a climate emergency and a biodiversity emergency, and we needed to be able to, just like with COVID, use emergency legislation. And you can see, you know, where we were going with that, right? And I argued against it. So I suppose that my concern, and you say, how are we going to do it? I mean, for me, it's like good old-fashioned politics, right? You have to keep winning arguments. And I suppose I'm very conscious of how many people listening hate me. And I think that there's a real danger that people get stuck in echo chambers, right? And I, you know, I don't care that people hate me, by the way. That's neither here nor there. What my concern is that if people are in echo chambers, and when they hear somebody who's broadly a lockdown skeptic, who's argued consistently publicly for 18 months about this, but because I won't entirely fit in with the narrative or the worldview that they want, then that seems to me as big a problem as a global outlook that only sees people in a particular way by the elites. The way that the elites' politics are defeated is when ordinary mass people in democracies don't let them get away with it. But we can't agree amongst ourselves, right?
Yes.
That's a blow. I mean, they're going to carry on, and people can start going, shut her up. We don't want people like that on sellout, bloody well. Fine. Well, that's not going to be very effective. And I'm not complaining to you, because it's a realism. I've realized this over, yeah, I mean, I've seen it before anyway, but that's what I'm trying to say to you is we've got to have a different attitude to politics, which involves us creating a public sphere that the politicians have to take notice of. Politicians are not good. There's no other way of doing it. That's what happens. And the one thing that we did learn from Brexit was they called a referendum thinking they were going to win, thought nobody'd bother, right? And they lost, right? And at the very least, democracy surprises people. Historically, for hundreds of years, what's happened is the ruling elites have wanted to do things, and ordinary people have stood in their way and said, no, you're not getting away with that. So we have to build a movement, and that movement has to be able to encompass some very narrow principles and some very broad discussions and some honest reflection amongst ourselves. I'm despairing a little of the fact that one thing that lockdown's done to all of us is it's made people go a bit, they're so frustrated, they've gone over the top. And I think that people have not got used to the hard job of building that kind of public movement, and therefore want it instantaneously built and want anyone who doesn't agree with them cancelled. And that to me is just the same as the anti-free speeches, right?
Yes,
it doesn't help.
Yeah, it's on every side. Yeah, absolutely right. Now, I agree with you that the public movement is absolutely necessary, and I think one that goes beyond the echo chamber is absolutely necessary. And in order to do that, to be quite frank, we do need to listen to people who see the world differently, which you know is the essence of debate. And my view on debate is that it's a fantastic way to learn about other people's map of the world. But it also helps you clarify your own thinking. But also, if you are disagreeing with someone else, then you can better understand the reasons why you disagree, and that can happen.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree.
But we're seeing some fascinating debate. You know, I've had some fascinating debates over the last couple of months where I brought a couple of scientists together, and the polar opposite kind of view. But actually, by the end of it, they acknowledge, because it's conducted in a rational way, become aware of it, and actually they've each actually moved a little bit closer to each other because they finally stood and listened to each other. You know, what we've seen so far is that you've got the pro-lockdown cohort over there, the anti-lockdown cohort over here, nothing in the middle, which brings them together to actually say, well, we're all facing a series of problems that we actually need to solve. But at the minute, we are leaving it to the technocrats who have all been brought together from an old boys network who have one way of thinking. In order to break that, we need people to come together, and we won't do that by dividing. You know, the media does a great job of dividing us, but we do a terrible job if we divide each other within the same thought process. You know, it's my fight. We've gone slightly over time, but I have one final question, if I may. That the public movement is one side. The Lords, now the Lords have often been seen as kind of the last bastion of sense, in the sense that, you know, if something goes through the Commons and makes its way to the Lords, there's this final opportunity to, you know, have experienced minds really sense check whether it's the right thing to do. What role does the Lords play in this pandemic response, and what, you know, has it played an adequate role in it, and what could that look like going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I've only been there like, I think, less than 10 months, and people will know, pointing out that you know, I actually think the House of Lords is anti-democratic, and I rather opportunistically said yes after I was persuaded to become a Baroness, because I thought I'd have a platform. So you make of that what you will. But it's been fascinating because I've never been a legislator, so it's like being a whole new thing for me, watching this happen. And I think the question you ask is important. But so in a way, in the Commons, because there's such a large majority for the Tories, the Lords has got a disproportionately high influence on any legislation at the moment, because the Tories know they can get it through the Commons. Then it has to go to the Lords. And then, in a way, you can, if you're in the Lords, but this can be on anything, you know, from domestic abuse to animal welfare or anything, the Lords could put loads of amendments in, and in a way the government has to confront the Lords more than it does the House of Commons, which, by the way, is not good for democracy overall, because obviously everyone in the Lords are appointed, undemocratic, and often see themselves as the kind of expert technocrats that you've just talked about. So they think that they're there for a good reason, if often they're not. And God knows what I'm doing there. But anyway, so that's that. It does mean that but what I've tried to do is to just use every opportunity to ask ministers to raise issue, Lord Bethel, the health minister, to raise the questions that other people have not had an opportunity to ask in the Commons, to find where they brought in statutory instruments which they're discussing upstairs, round the corner in a committee room where you're not meant to go and it's meant to be nodded through, and I turn up and they're like, oh God. And at least I get a 5-minute speech and then I put it on social media. At least I can shine a light on the process and the lack of scrutiny through being there, if that makes any sense, and pick up on things. And I suppose have had some influence. I think in terms of the way forward is just that Parliament, though, in general, Commons and the Lords haven't worked properly because they've been demobilised. So at any given time in the Lords, there's only been 30 people, most of the physically in the chamber. Most people are zooming in, and it's just not the same. The same has been true in the Commons. And then the way that it usually works, apparently, because I've never been there for this, is that the Commons and the Lords physically would meet up and talk about plans, what they would do if they agreed on something. And there's been no one to do that. So I went to my first ever meeting physically with MPs the other week to discuss what we could do together about ensuring that the COVID legislation is given a challenge, that we hold the government to account for lockdown, and really by way of saying you can't ever do this again, if you know what I mean. Lockdown is not an option, and gaining evidence and so on. And it was like so fantastic to be in the room with a few people, it was like, oh, excited. And because I felt like we might be able to do something productive. And so that's what it's like. But the thing to mainly report to you is that there is very little opposition in the Lords. And, honestly, the Lib Dems and the Labour Party, I mean, what kind of opposition are they? I mean, it's just pathetic. And even when they kind of say we don't like COVID passports, right? And you think, great, how exciting, right? And then they say, but what we need is double masking, compulsory at all time. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but it's like that. And then they say, and anyway, we don't need COVID passports because the real problem was we should never have unlocked so soon. And the problem is that the nightclubs are super spreaders, and therefore the only reason they're bringing in COVID passports to nightclubs is because they open too soon. You think, great allies you are, right? And then there are some independent backbenchers and some Tory backbenchers. But I think that the Tory backbenchers, some of whom have spoken out, but many of them have been kind of browbeaten by whips and so on and so forth. There's a kind of atmosphere of kind of jaded, fatalism. And the worst thing in the world is fatalism for all of us, by the way. By the way, one of the problems with conspiracy thinking is that you think everything's inevitable and there's nothing you can do about it. And it's like, that's as fatalistic as it. I mean, we can change things. Genuinely, we can change things. I don't think it's going to get changed at the Lords, but those of us who are in the Lords or the Commons who have a voice can, at least in that sphere, give voice to what a lot of people think outside of those places. But where change really will happen will not be there.
Do you think we need some form of political revolution to really bring democracy, or even a direct democracy with the technology we have available to us, to actually, is it time to really rethink politics in the modern age?
Yeah, I come from a tradition of being in the Revolutionary Communist Party. Some various people, as the debate has gone on, have quoted every smear about me quoted from The Guardian that's ever been there, which makes me laugh because I thought this was meant to be skeptical. They're all going, is this the woman who, I read this on Wikipedia. But yes, one true fact is I was in the Revolutionary Communist Party. And when you say, is it revolutionary? I think politics is broken at the moment, and you can't just kind of like declare a revolution. What you do have to do is to say the mainstream parties are not fit for purpose. it is time for us to be serious about trying to build an alternative. One good slogan that came out of the Brexit Party, which, whether you like it or not, was changing politics for good. Now, I'm not saying that that was what the Brexit Party delivered, but the changing politics for good had a real resonance with people, right? Because people recognise the two-party system and these particular parties have run out of steam. They're post-war parties that now no longer represent even the conservatism of the conservatives or the labouring masses that the Labour used to, right? So we should be open to the possibility of building new, but nobody should underestimate how bloody hard it is to build new movements. And that's why I keep stressing, that's why I'm having a go at our side, you see.
Yeah.
That for me, that's like, we've got to sort our own house out. I know what they're like. I know what the problem is over there, but we're not problem free ourselves.
I totally agree. Yeah, definitely. I mean, even down to unity of messaging is something that needs to be addressed. You know, there's lots of work to be done in order to create change. I always think, you know, I remember going to a horse racing event for a friend's stag do or a birthday party or something. There's this giant storm, and I thought, in a giant storm, anything can happen. So I put £5 or something on the lowest ranked horse, and lo and behold, it won the race. And I truly believe we're in a storm right now, and anything is possible, but it won't be possible if we're not even willing to put on a bet. You know, we got to place a stake. We got to play our part. We can't just be passive observers and watch the world go round. It's down to us to make the change. And I think you're absolutely right. It's down to the people. We aren't passive observers, or some are, but it's time for us to become actively engaged in changing the course of history. And I do believe in the power within us to do that. So fascinating. Thank you for your time. Fascinating conversation. You appreciate we've looked at the comments together. Not everyone sees eye to eye, but nonetheless, I think it's this insightful conversation. And I think there is lots we do agree on. And I think it's good to get balance and perspective. So thank you very much for your patience and for taking us through your views on the situation.
By the way, I don't object to the people making the comments. I was just drawing attention to the fact that we can't pretend we all agree. But yeah, no, thanks for inviting me. You know, I think you knew that we wouldn't agree on everything, and that's part of what building a new movement and changing history is all about. Is having frank, open discussions where we don't try and ban each other or smear each other, but try and understand exactly where we might be able to work together.
Yeah, adult conversations without yelling at each other and smearing each other. That's absolutely right. So check out the Academy of Ideas, where Claire, you'll find Claire, academyofideas.org.uk. Alistair actually was at our lockdown summit last week from the Academy of Ideas. So please do check out and you've got a debate coming up this weekend, you say? Yeah,
we've got a day of debates at Church House called Open for Debate. It's a Battle of Ideas event. Anyway, just when you look at the website, you can see it, but 4 debates on, by the way, non-COVID related, on free speech, on racism in society and how, you know, what it is and what it isn't, and all sorts of things, but the levelling up agenda allegedly, all that sort of stuff, and how to win an argument in days of conformity. And we're keeping it COVID free, not because we don't want to fall into the trap of thinking the only thing we should talk about is that. Yes. But it's also the case that I bet you what we'll talk about all day is that.
Yeah, you mean the world still exists outside the COVID
The world
debate.
does still exist.
Well, check it out, Academy of Ideas, academyofideas.org.uk. Thank you very much once again to Claire Fox for being with us today. And again, for those of you perhaps tuning in for the first time, please do make sure you subscribe to the Pandemic Podcast. We still face the same censorship challenges as everyone else. We've managed to keep going across all of the mainstream platforms, but we've had a couple of blips on the way. So please go to danjgregory.com/pandemic. Take you 1 minute of your time to join our mailing list to make sure you'll stay on top of our latest content. I'll be back again tomorrow. Good night to all of you. Thank you for engaging in the chat. And thank you once again to Claire Fox here this evening on the Pandemic Podcast.
Cheers.